Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Kamau Brathwaite's nation language. This is really an excerpt from a larger lecture that was then republished called History of the Voice. And I'm reading the excerpt out of the Norton Anthology of English Literature. So Brathwaite is a Caribbean poet, writer, thinker, post-colonial critic. He is from Barbados, and he's a big proponent of using Caribbean language to reflect a distinctive response to English colonialism, to British colonialism, and to reflect the dynamic cultural hybridity, the dynamic identities of Caribbean people through language choices. He shares a lot of, this comes out in 1979, so this is prior to Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, which for me is a huge touchstone for this type of work. Brathwaite is definitely, I assume he's a direct inspiration for Ngugi. I don't remember specifically in Decolonizing the Mind whether he discusses Brathwaite, but the ideas are certainly reflected here. This idea of language, education, and literature as ways of breaking particular identities and then reforging them in a colonized model. So breaking African identities in particular, or Afro-Caribbean identities in particular, and then reforging them, recreating them on an English model, an anglicized model. So Brathwaite talks about the plurality of languages in the Caribbean and how it creates a hybrid approach to language, what he comes to call nation language. So he says, we in the Caribbean have a similar kind of plurality. He's responding here to a previous lecture by Dennis Brutus, a South African poet, who talked about South African languages. And South Africa has 11 official languages, I think, and probably hundreds of regional, local variations of those languages. So he says, we in the Caribbean have a similar kind of plurality. We have English, which is the imposed language on much of the archipelago. English is an imperial language, as are French, Dutch, and Spanish. We have what we call Creole English, which is a mixture of English and an adaptation that English took in the new environment of the Caribbean when it became mixed with other imported languages. We have also what is called nation language, which is the kind of English spoken by the people who were brought to the Caribbean, not the official English now, but the language of slaves and laborers, the servants who were brought in by the conquistadors. Finally, we have the remnants of ancestral languages still persisting in the Caribbean. This is Amerindian, which is active in certain parts of Central America, but not in the Caribbean, because the Amerindians are a destroyed people and their languages were practically destroyed. We have Hindi spoken by some of the more traditional East Indians who live in the Caribbean, and there are also varieties of Chinese. And miraculously, there are survivals of African languages still persisting in the Caribbean. We have that spectrum, that prism of languages. And out of this, what he asserts is that African languages spoken by enslaved people who were brought over against their will were repressed in the Caribbean. They were repressed and replaced with English. But that repression was not complete. It was not erasure. It was repression. But the rhythms of West African languages, some of the vocabulary of West African languages, and the mindset reflected by those languages was maintained, even though it was maintained at a the level of sort of sub-linguistics, linguistic signs, rather than at the level of language and content itself. And this is a complicated thing, but he does sort of make this clear how this actually functioned. But he starts from the point of the repression. So what he says here is, in the Caribbean, as in South Africa, and in any area of cultural imperialism for that matter, the education system did not recognize the presence of these various languages. What our education system did was to recognize and maintain the language of the conquistador, the language of the planter, the language of the official, the language of the Anglican preacher. It insisted that not only would English be spoken in the Anglophone Caribbean, but that the educational system would carry the contours of an English heritage. And this is really where Brathwaite gets very close to what Ngugi will talk about in Decolonizing the Mind. This idea that because Afro-Caribbean children were taught from English literature, especially British literature, but English literature in particular, Austen, Shakespeare, Dickens, Wordsworth, Byron, people like this, that the way they were trained to look at the world by the education system was a British way of looking at the world rather than a Caribbean way of looking at the world. And the example that Brathwaite gives here is we were more excited by English literary models, by the concept of, say, Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood, than we are by Nanny of the Maroons, a name some of us didn't even know until a few years ago. And in terms of what we write, our perceptual models, we are more conscious in terms of sensibility of the falling of snow, for instance. The models are all there for the falling of the snow, than of the force of the hurricanes that take place every year. In other words, we haven't got the syllables, the syllabic intelligence to describe the hurricane, which is our own experience, whereas we can describe the imported alien experience of the snowfall. It is that kind of situation that we are in. And so essentially what he argues is, because of the way the education system has shaped Caribbean people's minds, and this is under English colonialism, and then particularly carrying forward into the first few decades after colonial independence. I think many African countries, Caribbean countries, have now moved somewhat away from an almost exclusively British canon in their education system. But it was a way of using language and the education system to train people not to recognize or not to be able to express their own experiences, their own culture, the world out of which they come. And as Ngugi will later point out, this is a form of cultural alienation. It alienates the person from their environment and the culture that produced them, which fundamentally undermines their own existence, their own sense of self. But what Brathwaite argues here is that, in fact, the language of Caribbean people, despite this, retains elements of resistance. That patois, even some Creole languages, perhaps, are forms of resistance to English identity and English colonialism, because they maintain the rhythms of African language, because they retain some of the word choice of West African dialects, because Caribbean writers, particularly starting from the 40s, from the 50s, people like Louise Bennett, like Claude McKay, Derek Walcott, Grace Nichols, Brathwaite himself, because these people started to use Caribbean language as a way of presenting their own identities, not just as we can imitate English forms, but to try and experiment with the forms of language, the structure of language, the sound of poetry, particularly, to reflect the rhythms of Caribbean life, Afro-Caribbean life, and its derivative elements brought from West Africa, from indigenous Caribbean people, from the blending of these different colonial languages, etc., etc. And so what Brathwaite ultimately sort of says here is, I think, however, that language does really have a role to play here, certainly in the Caribbean. This is in creating revolutions, particularly, I think, revolutions of thought, changing how people think about themselves in the world, their place in the world, etc., etc. But it is an English that is not the standard imported, educated English, but that of the submerged, surrealist experience and sensibility, which has always been there and which is now increasingly coming to the surface and influencing the perception of contemporary Caribbean people. It is what I call, as I say, nation language. I use the term in contrast to dialect. The word dialect has been bandied about for a long time, and it carries very pejorative overtones. Dialect is thought of as bad English. Dialect is inferior English. Dialect is the language when you want to make fun of someone. Caricature speaks in dialect. Dialect has a long history coming from the plantation, where people's dignity was distorted through their languages and the descriptions that the dialect gave to them. Now, this is, I think, a really interesting, powerful quote. And if you want to think about the project of Caribbean dialect, not dialect in the dismissive sense that he is talking about here, but in a more linguistic sense, Caribbean variations of English, patois, Creole, all of these sort of differentiated Caribbean languages, Brathwaite's nation language, this is how to understand it. Nation language, on the other hand, is the submerged area of that dialect that is much more closely allied to the African aspect of experience in the Caribbean. It may be English, or it may be in English, but often it is an English which is like a howl or a shout or a machine gun or the wind or a wave. It is also like the blues, and sometimes it is English and African at the same time.